In this video, we'll go over 10 monsters who have question mark for attack, and try to go over which ones are the best or something. And at number 10, we have Evil Hero Dark Gaia. Back in the days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Online, this card was actually kind of a monster, because it could have over 6,000 attack and flip a defense position monster face up when it tried to attack over something, in a game that didn't have good effect negation or hand traps. Of course, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This card isn't really a big deal, because it's basically just a beat stick with no protection. So if you just effect veiler it, you will lose all of its attack and go to 0. And most decks run some form of effect negation. Also, most decks don't usually start their turns by setting a monster face down. So the ability to attack over things in defense position doesn't really mean anything. But when this card first came out, when combined with Dark Calling, which allowed you to use fusion materials from your graveyard, it was actually kind of a monster to be feared. And at number 9, we have Odd Eyes Revolution Dragon. This card has a hand effect where you can discard it and pay 500 life points to add a level 8 or lower Dragon Pendulum type monster from your deck to your hand. That effect alone lets it make the list because there aren't too many cards with question mark for attack. It does have a pendulum scale of 12, but he can only be used on a pendulum summon of a dragon type monster. However, you can destroy this card while in the pendulum scale and special summon an extra deck dragon type monster from your graveyard. Its effect for being summoned though is very hard to pull off. You either have to pendulum summon this card, and since it's level 12, you can only accomplish this by having a card which increases the scales above 12, or another card which lowers the level of this monster in your hand. Its alternative summoning condition is to tribute 3 dragon type monsters, and the 3 need to be a fusion, synchro, and an exceeds. Meaning, its summoning conditions are really convoluted. But its effect is good, because you can pay half your life points to shuffle all the cards in the field and the graveyards into both players' decks. And it gains attack and defense equal to half of your opponent's life points. One of the better uses of this card when it first came out was to have a Supreme King Dragon Starving Venom to try and copy its effect in the graveyard after sending itself to the graveyard to activate its searching effect. That way you got its amazing board wipe effect without having to actually summon the monster. Starving Venom is a banned card though, so the best use of this card is its search function, which is actually a good effect. And at number 8 we have Tragoedia. This card used to be a staple that was seen in pretty much every deck, and it was once at the point where this card was semi-limited on the ban list for the longest time. Nowadays no one really uses this card, but it's still not half bad anyway. This card has 3 effects. The first is if you take battle damage, you can special summon this card from your hand, and it will gain 600 attack and defense for every card in your hand. Once per turn, you can copy the level of a monster in your graveyard. And its third effect, once per turn you can discard a monster to take control of an opponent's monster that has the same level as the monster you discarded. All 3 of these effects are good, and historically, it was used for its first and second effects. Special summon it after your opponent's last attack. And then using its level manipulation effect to have the perfect level for a synchro or exceeds play. And its third effect of stealing a monster has always been kinda situational, but if you could pull it off, it was a really good effect. But with the game advancing as far as it has, its effects are kinda slow. Level manipulation isn't as important as it used to be, and that's why it rarely sees play today. And at number 7, we have Ascension Sky Dragon. This card has the effect where, when it's synchro summoned, it gains 800 attack times the number of cards in your hand. Kinda like Tragoedia's effect, where he gains 600 attack for every card in your hand, except Ascension Sky Dragon checks your hand only when it's summoned, and then its attack doesn't modify based on the number of cards you have in your hand again, like Tragoedia. So it's a little bit easier to try to get this card to a higher attack value, as having 4 cards in your hand will give this card 3200 attack. Its second effect is a floating effect, where if this card is destroyed by an opponent's card, you can special summon the monsters used to synchro summon this card from your graveyard, but their effects are negated. Now, it doesn't really do anything outside of gaining attack based on cards in your hand and floating into the monsters that made it. But what was unique about this card when it first came out was that it was one of 2 generic level 10 synchro monsters. Before Ascension Sky Dragon, the only other level 10 generic synchro monster was YuGiOh. YuGiOh was a much better synchro monster, so it was chosen over Ascension Sky Dragon most of the time. But if you were playing a synchro deck that went into level 10 synchros, and you knew your opponent liked to blow up your field all the time, Ascension Sky Dragon was a viable alternative. Number 6. Divine Serpent Geh. This card can only be special summoned from your hand if a monster you control is destroyed by your opponent, either by them attacking or by one of their card effects. Then you can pay half your life points to special summon this card from your hand. This card has 2 battle-related effects. The first being, if it attacks a monster, you can negate its effect and have that monster's attack. And its other effect is if it battles a monster, you can increase this card's attack to become equal to the highest original attack on the field. Also, it can't be targeted by card effects, which gives it some great protection. Since this card can modify its attack during any of its battles, it basically always will have the highest attack on the field, unless your opponent is using a monster who increases their attack by other means. And since it can both increase its attack to the highest attack on the field, and have the attack of the monster it attacks, it can beat over pretty much anything, especially since it negates the monster's effects when it attacks it. So the way to destroy this card would be with non-targeting card effects, or attacking over it with a monster that could increase its attack. Since Divine Serpent Geh can only have the opponent's monster attack if it declares an attack himself. But its copy another monster's attack effect can be used if it's attacked, so as long as your opponent uses a monster like Boral Sword Dragon or Utopia the Lightning, you can attack over this card pretty easily. But the fact that this card has an easy summoning requirement, pretty good built-in protection, and a tricky way to destroy monsters by battle, it makes it a pretty good option for certain stall decks, as added insurance in case their cards get destroyed. And at number 5, we have Chimeratech Overdragon. This card was such a problem when it first came out that it got Future Fusion banned and Overload Fusion put on the limited list. Chimeratech Overdragon is a fusion monster with the materials of 1 Cyber Dragon plus 1 or more machine-type monsters. And when it's summoned, you destroy all the cards you control, and the original attack and defense of this card is equal to the number of fusion materials used to make it, times 800. Also, this card can attack your opponent's monsters equal to the number of monsters used for this card's fusion summon. So if you used 5 cards to bring this guy out, it would have 4,000 attack and the ability to attack 5 monsters. Now with Future Fusion, you could send every machine-type monster in your deck to the graveyard, including at least 1 Cyber Dragon. Then you could use Overload Fusion to banish all those cards from the graveyard to bring out Chimeratech Overdragon with easily over 10,000 attack, and the ability to attack every monster your opponent controls. So if they just had 1 monster face up, they could lose the duel from just the massive amounts of battle damage. And back in the day, when a huge beat stick that could attack multiple times was considered a big deal, they banned Future Fusion and put Overload Fusion to 1, just to stop this 1 fusion monster. Number 4. Gren Maju Die Eiza. This card has the effect where it gains attack and defense equal to the number of your removed from play cards times 400. What makes this card good is the fact that the cards banished don't need to be face up. So cards like Pot of Desires and Pot of Extravagance, 2 cards which have you banish a whole bunch of cards face down in order to draw 2 cards, really good cards, who also just boost Gren Maju to really high attack power values. 1 Pot of Desires gives Gren Maju 4,000 attack, and Pot of Indulgence gives Gren Maju 2,400 attack. So if you run an anti-meta deck with cards like Eater of Millions, you can get Gren Maju to over 8,000 attack pretty easily. And since it's a level 3 monster with no summoning restrictions, you can also just normal summon it, or special summon it if you accidentally banished it, with Different Dimension Reincarnation. And since cards like Pot of Desires and Pot of Extravagance are so good, Gren Maju kind of got an indirect boost when those cards came out. Number 3. The Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode. This is probably one of the most used cards that will appear on this list, but you'll understand why it's not number 1 once you see the first 2 spots. This card has the effect where you can tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters to normal summon it to your opponent's side of the field. And tributing your opponent's monsters is the best way to get rid of unkillable monsters like Towers or Great Magnus, or to get through unbreakable boards with things like Trigate Wizard U-Links. Since tributing your opponent's monsters doesn't count as activating an effect, there's very little they can do outside of preventing you from being able to normal summon. The trade-off of this card is the fact that you lose your normal summon for that turn, and of course giving them a 0 attack monster that they can then use for link plays on their next turn. Which is to say, pretty good trade-off for what it's able to accomplish. And that's why Sphere mode is ran in a lot of side decks, just in case they're going to face some kind of unbreakable boards with negates, or an unkillable monster. Now, the original intended use of this card was to summon the Winged Dragon of Ra without having to activate its garbage original summon requirement, but it's not really used for that, so I'm just going to mention that it is technically used for something else right here and move on. Number 2, Eater of Millions. This card has the effect where, once per battle, it can banish the monster it's battling face down before the damage step, so it can crash over pretty much any monster, and it's protected during your opponent's turn from pretty much any one monster attack. Its summoning requirements have you banish 5 or more cards from your hand, field, or extra deck face down in order to bring it out, which means the best way to summon it is to banish 5 cards from your extra deck, which is a pretty steep cost for a lot of extra deck focused decks, which is a lot of them. But there are also a few meta decks that don't use their extra deck and love to run Eater of Millions as a get over any monster card. Eater of Millions also has a negative effect where it can't be tributed, used for a fusion, synchro, or exceed summon. But this actually just kind of protects it from sphere mode and kaijus, since the card can't be tributed, turning its negative effect into kind of a positive defensive effect, since lots of decks use monster effects in order to get rid of Eater of Millions, since they lose one monster if they try attacking into it. Eater of Millions also gains an additional 100 attack and defense for every banished face down card, but this card is rarely used for its attack gain effect, which is pretty lackluster. Coincidentally, Eater of Millions is really good in a Gren Maju deck, since they can banish 5 or more cards from your extra deck. Meaning, in a Gren Maju deck, Eater of Millions can banish all 15 cards from your extra deck to give Gren Maju an additional 6,000 attack, since you have the option to banish 5 or more. Eater of Millions mostly sees play in Trickstar decks and niche uses in other meta decks, making it a pretty good card, and one of the best monsters with a question mark for an attack. And at number 1, we have Zoodiac Drident. Zoodiac Drident is currently banned for being a little too good. Same with Zoodiac Broadbull, who is also currently banned and also has question mark for attack. So I'll be putting both of those together, since I don't like to have cards from the same archetype at different spots on the same list. Zoodiac Broadbull has an effect to search any Beast Warrior type monster from your deck that can be normal summon or set, and this effect is only a soft once per turn, meaning if you bring out multiple copies of this card during the same turn, you can potentially get 3 searches from this effect. And the way Zoodiacs work is you can rank up a single Zoodiac monster with one of your Exceeds Zoodiac monsters. So bringing out 1 Broadbull a turn is effortless, basically. But this effect of only using 1 monster for an Exceed summon is only once per turn per Exceeds monster. So if you wanted to bring out multiple Broadbulls, you'd have to bring out the additional ones normally with 2 level 4 monsters, which with Zoodiac Ratpier, when he was at 3 copies anyway, was a really easy thing to do. This card had a great search effect and an archetype that could bring it out way too easily, and that's why it's currently banned. Zoodiac Drident has an effect where once per turn during either player's turn, you can detach an Exceeds material to destroy 1 face-up card on the field. And this effect is great. Usually, effortless spell speed 2 effects that can destroy your opponent's cards during their turn is a requirement for a deck to be really good, basically. And Drident is really easy to bring out in their archetype, meaning if you do destroy one, you can almost guarantee to see another one on your next turn. And also, because of the way the Zoodiacs work, it was common for them to equip Zoodiac Whiptail as one of its Exceeds materials, giving Drident the ability to attack over anything as well. As Whiptail had the effect where while Whiptail was equipped as an Exceeds material to a Beast Warrior monster, that card gained the effect to banish an opponent's monster that it battled after damage calculation. So even if your opponent tried to attack over your Zoodiac Drident, they would get their monster banished in the process, especially since Zoodiac Whiptail could equip himself to Drident during the battle phase from your hand. Kinda like a little surprise for your opponent, trying to get over this monster with a really good effect that disrupts plays during their turn. And as for their question mark attack nature, they simply gained attack and defense equal to all of the Zoodiac monsters attached to them as Exceeds materials. Generally, that meant they all had pretty low attack and defense though. Alright, and that's it for the video. If you know of any other good question mark attack monsters that should have made this list, I'd love to hear about them. Also, if you have any ideas for videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them as well down in the comments.